Probably after we to those solutions. John, you spoke at the second forum into veteran suicide and one. Will be in a minute. Thank you very much for calling up. Well, just a box in a moment. I wonder whether you want to listen to the rabbi? Yes. Which is really good. The people involved. So happen. But they've only been copying for years. Only copying. Search 11 and 13. I find a 10-week-old Labrador called. Thanks, Adira. Speak to you later. Thank you. Bye. Puppy knows the big toilet is in the middle of the night, and this puppy was out at 4:30 a.m. Mum took it outside. Somebody gently thinks, funny, it runs out, attacks the puppy, and kills it. Which sort of that's what boxers do. Keep those kids to get back to the park, and only having 2 weeks. There is CCTV footage of it. The same fox was actually hunting the puppy. Surprisingly little, not that they're hunting, so they do. Foxes are normally wary of humans. They're not keen on civilization. Maybe urban foxes are becoming too brave, too confident. If you see them around and you have trouble with them killing pets, unusual cats and dogs, they're everywhere. I don't know what you can do about that. People Victoria Mainland saying foxes are way they are smart, very smart. They are hunters. And they're normally very wary of humans, so if you've got company in a suburban backyard, they've heard of case like that before. What? Three, an expert view on that. Transport diversions in place in the Lockett High Street is closed between Hull Street and Westgard Street for Bridge Street. For the area, get on Harvard Road or Westgard Street to avoid closure. Also disruptions for Route 86 trains through the area. Check the PTV Apple website. From the Hotel Road exit ramp from Monash Freeway is closed inbound for works. You can detour using Warrigal Road and Princess Highway. High Street in Norfolk is currently closed between Westgard Street and Hull Street. So Monday is Plan ahead. Biggroads.big.gov.au/High Street. Hi, I'm Liam from Bound.
Good morning. Okay. So we have 17 people on 18 people on Zoom. So I'm making up. People want to be in person. People want to be on Zoom. All good with me. Obviously, more in person the better. So I'll do my weekly pull to try and bring people back into the Beit Midrash. It's lovely to learn with you all, both from near and afar. Okay. So firstly, Chanukah Sameach to everyone. I like to say Chanukah Sameach rather than Chag Sameach because it might not officially be a Chag. And we often say Chag Sameach when we're talking because about one of the particular Korbanot is the Korban Chagiga and celebratory offering. And obviously on Chanukah, there is, being a rabbinic Chag, there is no Korban Chagiga. So I like to be very yekish about it. And I like to say Chanukah Sameach rather than Chag Sameach. But that should not take away from the joy of Chanukah. Okay. It's fascinating that Vayechi is often, sorry, not Vayechi, that Chanukah often falls on Miketz. It's very common, and sometimes it doesn't happen. But this year we're going to have 3 Sifrei Torah on Shabbat because it's going to be Miketz and Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh, which is always fun. Okay. Can you see my screen at home? I'm using a slightly different browser. Can you see my screen? Yes? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. So feel free to interrupt with questions at home and in the room, of course. So we begin our parasha with Paro's dream, right? Or dreams in the plural, rather, I should say, as we look at the beginning of the first source. And it's this interesting pasuk, which we won't talk about today, but it happened at the end of 2 years. So we know that there's, since the end of last week's parasha, actually 2 years have passed that Yosef's been in jail. Ufaro cholem, and Paro is dreaming. V'hinei omed hayor, and his dream is standing over the river Nile. V'hinei min hayor olot sheva parot, and from the Nile ascend 7 cows. Yifot mareh, beautiful, vriot basar, very like fleshy cows. Vatirena ba'achlu, and they are grazing in the swamp. V'hinei sheva parot acherot olot achrehen, and 7 other cows follow after them. Min hayor, coming up the Nile. V'ot mareh v'dakot basar, ugly of appearance and incredibly thin. But ta'amodna etzel parot al sfat hayor, and they stand next to the other cows on the riverbank. But tachalna haparot ra'ot ha'ma'er v'takato basar, and the ugly cows and thin of appearance and flesh consume et sheva parot yifot ha'ma'er v'habriot. They eat up the 7 fatty and beautiful cows, healthy cows. Vayikat Paro, and Paro wakes up. And he falls asleep again. In Pasuk Hey, Vayishan, and he falls asleep again. Vayachalom shinit, he has another dream. V'hinei, behold, sheva shibolim olot b'kaneh echad briot b'tovot. 7 sheaves of wheat ascend on one stem. Briot b'tovot, a healthy crop. V'hinei sheva shibolim dakot u'shtuvot kadim sochot acharihem. And then 7 bundles of wheat, which are thin and sort of damaged by rough winds, sprout after them. And then the final pasuk, vativlana hashivulim hadakot, and the thin sheaves of wheat swallow up et sheva hashivulim habriot, swallow up the 7 healthy sheaves of wheat, bamleot, which were full and whole wheat, if you like. Vayikatz Paro, and Paro wakes up again. V'hinei chalom. So I'm just going to mute everyone again. The question is, okay. The question is, what exactly is going on in this dream? So we know that Paro is very disturbed by these dreams, and then, as we know, so the butler says, well, I had a man who interpreted dreams for me in prison, and he was great and worked. So Paro goes summon him, and we know that Paro summons Yosef, and they shave him, and it even says in the pasuk by Galchur, they shaved him, and they run him out and to Paro, and he interprets the dreams. But let's first look at, before we get to that stage, let's look at actually how Ramban understands what's going on in these dreams. Like typically we understand there's 2 dreams, and they're talking about 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. But Ramban wants to look slightly at the details of each dream. So he says, "V'hinei min hayara olot." From the Ya'ar, which typically means the river Nile, these cows ascend. So it says Ramban, "Ba'avur ki eretz Mitzrayim tishtem min hayar." Why do we use the imagery of the river Nile? Because the land of Egypt drinks from the Nile. Umimenu ba lahem hasova v'hara'av. Because the river Nile from there, meaning from the river Nile, is where all the questions of sova, plenty, v'ra'av, and famine, that's where it all emanates from. Meaning the Nile is a symbol of food and sustenance, whether they're going to have a year of plenty or not. Ra'a otan olot min hayar. That's why Paro in his dream sees them ascend from the Nile. The Nile represents in Mitzrayim food, very much like in Israel, rain represents food, and therefore often we look at the Tochacha, we look at the rebuke in also in Bechukotai and again in Parshat Ki Tavo. Always when it's talk about Am Yisrael, it's always will there be rain or not be rain. So the equivalent in Egypt, which is an irrigational system rather than one based on rain, is always will the Nile produce things or not. So the Nile is a symbol for the question of food and sustenance. So that's what the Nile represents in the dream. He continues there in the second line there. The haparot and the cows, siman lacharisha. This is an interesting way of thinking. You might think, well, the cow is meaty, so it represents plenty of food. Ramban says no, it's a siman lacharisha. Charisha is plowing, like choresh. It's a sign of plowing, meaning the cows which have the yoke on them in the fields. Hashibalim, and obviously the wheat. The wheat sheaves, siman lekatsir, is a sign of harvesting. Why does Ramban say that the cows is a sign of plowing? Because I think the whole point here is we're not talking about sustenance of meat. That's what's bothering Ramban here. The whole question is what's growing from the ground, and therefore the cows can't represent. Is it going to be a good year of meat? Is it going to be good meat at Continental or not? That's not the question here. The question here is what the cows representing what grows from the ground, and therefore Ramban comes to the conclusion that the cows represent the plows rather than the meat themselves. And of course, the wheat that's more simple to understand. That's a siman lekatsir, is a sign of the harvest.
Why would he not be comfortable with the notion that it's about meat?
Why would he not be comfortable with the notion that it's about meat? I think Ramban is saying that the whole dream here is all about whether the ground is going to produce crop or not, and therefore he wants the analogy to be more complete.
But it's related. I mean, you've only got to get the good meat if there's good stuff in the ground.
Sure, you're only getting good meat because they do consume from the ground. That's an interesting question, and I haven't seen other people who say directly that the cows represent the plowing. Ramban again is trying to say that the whole dream is analogous with what's growing directly from the ground, and therefore rather than parot, the cows being like a secondary source of sustenance, rather he's saying that they represent the crop, because the whole thing is about the Ya'ar and about what's ascending from the Nile, which is the source of water.
If the cows were about meat because the cows eat grain, then the grain dream would have had to come first.
So, right, okay, so Debbie's pointed out here, well, if that were the case, that it was secondary, then maybe the dream of the cows should have come afterwards. The fact that it came first is because you plow before the crop sprouts. Thank you for that, Debbie. It's a great, if I may say so myself. It's a great explanation. Okay, so that's what goes on. We're in the middle of the second line in Ramban there. Komosha Amar, and he also quotes from later on. By the way, this might also be Susan. This might also where it comes from, because later on he talks about that the 7 years Asher en charish v'katsir at the end of the second line there in Ramban, where there is no plowing nor harvesting. So this basically it complements what we see here, which is that the first dream represents plowing and the second dream represents harvesting. So if you like it fits well with the description in a few chapters' time as to there's no plowing and then there's no harvesting. So that might be another reason. Ra'ah, so what did Paro see? He saw the Nile only ascended a little bit. The Ein Charish, and there's no plowing. 1 second. Okay. So he occasionally, so he saw that the Nile didn't. The Nile only ascended a little bit, but in Charish, and there was no plowing. That's what happens later. So that's what the cows are ascending from the Nile, is that the ability to plow followed by the ability to harvest. Asher yizra'u ma'at b'mkomot halachim yavok hadim ruach Hashem v'yisrof otam. And what is this continuation of the dream? I'm just going to ask people to mute if they're just because of the background noise. Try again. Okay, try again. All right. What is the continuation of the dream? That what happens that with the sheaves in the second dream? There's this ruach kadim, this strong eastern wind, which is always typically identified as a bad wind for the crop. So what does it mean? He says even what's the meaning of that symbol? Because we just said it's going to be a bad year. So why does it have to then add to it? So the Ramban in that last line, there, the third line says, and even the amount they do manage to successfully sow in the very small lachim, like the moist areas, Yavo kadim ruach Hashem yisrofotam. Then an eastern wind from Hashem, a harsh wind, will come and scorch them. And therefore that won't, even the little that does come, they are able to successfully plow and plant what will be no good. Just as he sees them in the dream being like scorched by a harsh east wind. So that is the symbolism for Ramban of the second bit of the dream, in the second dream, where there's this wind. Because if we said there's going to be an issue with the plowing, so what does it mean that then later a wind comes and scorches what's left? We just said there's not even going to be any plowing, let alone any harvesting. So Ramban is saying that extra detail, again, Ramban looking at the finer details of the dream, and says that, and the little that they are able to successfully plant, because there's already moist land that doesn't require plowing, even that won't succeed because a harsh wind will come and destroy it. So Ramban is going stage by stage and saying even the bit they do successfully plant still is no good. Then Ramban says an interesting point about the idea of the 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine in general. And that's the second paragraph here. V'hanir and it seems, says Ramban, Mimashma ktuvim, from the implication of the psukim, it seems to say that the 7 years of plenty, right, Sova, was in Eretz Mitzrayim alone. It was only in Egypt that there was the years of plenty. Kasher Ne'emar, as it says, and he quotes later on, Sova gadol b'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, great bounty in all of the land of Egypt, implying only the land of Egypt. That's how Yosef interprets the dream. V'chen, and similarly also later on, Asher hayu be'eretz Mitzrayim, the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt. The Torah emphasizes twice that the plenty was in the land of Egypt. Aval hara'av, whereas the famine, haya b'chol ha'aratzot, was in the whole region, in all the countries, the whole region. V'chen patar Yosef, and that's exactly how Yosef interpreted the dream. V'kamu sheva shnei ra'av, and because he says, and there will be 7 years of famine. And when he mentions the 7 years of famine, he doesn't add the words in the land of Egypt. He just says there'll be 7 years of famine. And therefore, lo yachlu b'shar haratzot likbotz ochel. That's why in all the other countries, they weren't able to gather food and store it, because they didn't have 7 years of plenty before the famine. They just had regular crop, and then they had famine. But and even if they'd heard about the whole matter of Paro's dream, because it was incredibly well known and publicized, still they couldn't have done anything about it because they didn't have 7 years of 20. So what's 7 years of plenty? So what's Ramban saying? Ramban is trying to understand objectively. Again, Ramban being very methodical and saying, how can it be that Mitzrayim were all sorted, right? And everyone came to Mitzrayim to, as the Torah tells us, to gather food, to gather bread, right? For supplies. And that's how the brothers end up in Egypt. It was all divinely engineered that the brothers would end up in Egypt with Yosef. Why? Why didn't everyone store? Which is why Ramban has to say, well, let's go back and re-understand. Every time it says 7 years of plenty, it always says, but Eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt. Only in the land of Egypt were there 7 years of plenty. And then followed by 7 years of famine. Everywhere else in the region, says Ramban, didn't have 7 years of extra food. They just had 7 regular years, followed by 7 years of famine. That's why they couldn't store food. They didn't have extra supplies which they could save. And that's, he says, as he ends off there, even if they heard about this impending famine which had been predicted in Paro's dream, because it was well known, because Paro has a dream, it's interpreted, and everyone goes and starts storing, they couldn't have done it. They didn't have the extra supplies. Again, just Ramban like looking ahead and saying, well, hang on a minute, why did the brothers come down? Why didn't they also store food? And the answer is they were not able to, because they didn't have 7 very successful years prior to the 7 years of famine. So just an interesting point that perhaps we didn't necessarily think about, but Ramban has already done the thinking here for us to try and understand pragmatically why is it that no one else stored. They couldn't. Only in Egypt they had that. And this also sheds light to the beauty of how Hashem plans the whole story, that only in Mitzrayim are they able to save. In Canaan, they can't save. The brothers are going to have to come down, because only in Mitzrayim is there room for plenty, in order that Yosef can interpret the dream there, help Mitzrayim, and only Mitzrayim, and nowhere else. And the rest of the world is helpless. Literally, everyone's looking to Egypt, put it unfortunately in morbid terms and modern terms, they're the only ones with the vaccine. Everyone's looking at them. They're the ones with the technology, right? They're the only ones with the solution. No one else can do anything other than look on and with envy and hope that they'll help them. And that's exactly understanding that now, that no one else had a choice to save. And it puts in perspective what happens when the brothers eventually do come down to Egypt and say, help us. And that image of the brothers coming before the leader, who they don't realize is their younger brother, Yosef, and saying, help us, is like even more like prominent when we understand that they really were helpless. There's nothing they could have done, and they could see this happening before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to prevent it for themselves. It just makes that image even more powerful when Ramban clarifies the various details here. So that's regarding Paro's dream. So we know what happens. Yosef interprets it, and he finds favor in Paro's eyes, and he gets a serious promotion from prison guard to viceroy of Egypt, effectively. Quite a promotion, if I may say so. And that takes us on to the next section. Vayitav hadavar be'einei Pharaoh uve'einei kol avadav, says the pasuk, and the matter was good in the eyes of Paro and in the eyes of all his servants. And then he has this weird pasuk, which seems like a bit of a compliment, although we're going to see Ramban tries to explain the rationale for such a comment. In the next pasuk, Lamed Chet. Vayomer Paro el avadav, and Paro says to his servants, Hanimsach hazeh ish asher ruach Elokim bo. Is there found, meaning is there around here such a guy who has the spirit of God in him? Nice compliment. We'll go into that in a moment. Vayomer Paro, and Paro says, and again, when the Torah tells us Vayomer Paro and then again Vayomer Paro, it almost implies that there's like a very pregnant pause in the middle, and then Paro has to give another comment. So it says, and Paro says twice, both in Lamed Chet and also Lamed Tet. So he says that pasuk, and we're going to talk about in Ramban why there might be a bit like a very pregnant pause there. Vayomer Paro, and Paro said, El Yosef, to Yosef, Achrei hodia Elokim otcha et kol zot, after God has informed you of all of this, Ein navon v'chacham kamocha, there is no one wise or clever like you. Ata tiyeh el beiti, you will be over my household, va'al picha yishat kol ami, and basically by your mouth will everyone draw, basically. Okay, this means be dependent on your word. Rak kisei egdal mimeka, and only by the throne will I be greater than you. Quite the promotion. But let's have a look again at that weird pasuk in Lamed Chet. Paro says, after finding favor after Yosef finds favor with him with the interpretations of his dream, Vayomer Paro el avadav hanimsach hazeh ish asher ruach Elokim bo. Is there around a man like this who has the spirit of God within him? So what is the purpose of this pasuk? So it seems like simply Paro is like really like wow, like amazed at his abilities. But Ramban takes it in a particular direction, which we're going to see now. So the Ramban immediately following those pasukim. But the reason it says hanimsach hazeh is there such a man like this? Why does it say this, says Ramban? Ba'avur, because shehaya ivri, because he was a Hebrew. V'hem snu'ei nefesh mitzrayim, and they are hated deeply by the Egyptians. Snu'ei nefesh mitzrayim. It means like they're classic enemies, like of the soul. Meaning the Egyptian, and we know this also from later when the brothers sit separately from Yosef, as Rashi tells us, the brothers sit separately when they do come down from the mill. And we know this also from later, like also what happens with later on down the story, with a couple hundred years later with the whole Exodus story with Yetziat Mitzrayim, about the idea and that they take they're meat eaters, which is the deity of Mitzrayim, and like the whole thing, they're snu'ei nefesh ha-Mitzrayim. They're hated. Egyptians are fundamentally the Hebrews are hated by the Egyptians. Lo yachlu maga'am, they won't. It's almost like you don't eat, we don't eat their wine, like Bishul Akam. Lo yachlu maga'am, they don't eat that which they come in contact with. V'lo yitchabru imahem, and they don't connect to them at all. Hitzmeim hemetzlam, they're impure by them. This is Ramban's understanding that Egyptians are like Hebrews are totally despised by Egyptians. Al-Ken, therefore, lo ratza lemanoto mishneh b'lo reshutam. Therefore, Paro did not want to appoint him viceroy without their permission. I mean that the avadim, because it's fascinating that if we go back to the psukim, who is present when Paro is saying this? He says, "Vayitav hadavar," the matter was good, be'einei Pharaoh, in the eyes of Paro, uve'einei kol avadav, and in the eyes of all his servants. It doesn't literally mean his slaves or his tenders. It means the people who are, his counselors and the people who are in his court. He wanted their permission. He did not want to appoint somebody who is from a nation which is despised by Egypt, right? Who was looked down upon by Egypt, below Rishutam, back to Ramban, that second line, without their permission. Therefore, he says to them, there's no Egyptian equivalent to Yosef. You're never going to find an Egyptian quite like him. Kiruach Elokim bo, who's the spirit of God is upon him. That is what the pasuk means, says Ramban. If we look back to the pasuk again, it says, Hanimtsach hazeh ish asher ruach Elokim bo. Does such a man like this exist who has the Spirit of God within him? So we understand that to be like a great compliment. Ramban says it's not only meant as a compliment, it's meant as, listen, we're not going to find anything better around here. Let's take him. That's how Ramban seems to understand it. Hanimtsach hazeh. Is there a local? Do we have a local equivalent who's as good as this guy? No. Let's get him in, because we're not going to find someone as good among our own stock, and therefore we have to appoint him. And then Ramban continues in the third line.
This is implying that they really think Elohim is something good.
Right. The question is what Elohim they're referring to might be a different
Yes,
story, but clearly they see something divine and otherworldly definitely in Yosef. Whether it's Hashem, the one and only God, or because they're not a monotheistic society, is a different thing. But the point is, it's almost like a kiddush Hashem. Like the typical, I guess the contemporary understanding of pasuk is like it's almost like a kiddush Hashem, like Ruach Elokim. But what Ramban is doing is taking it and saying, listen, you're not going to find someone with like an otherworldly, divine intuition quite like this man among our own, right? No local. We're going to have to go to the immigrant. That's basically what Ramban is saying here. We'll have to take in the immigrant because we don't have any local talent. That's basically what's being said here. And Ramban is saying, again, why is he doing it? Ramban is looking at the context, because they wouldn't so easily take a foreigner. I mean, I think this might be true about even modern society, that you take a non-citizen and then appoint them as deputy prime minister or whatever it is. That's already like a newbie. Not only that, but a prisoner, no doubt, who's been thrown in prison for apparently attacking the wife of a senior member of Paro's court, right? He was Potiphar's wife. That's why he was originally thrown in prison. And now he's being suddenly, brought out of jail and put as second in command. But Ramban, what bothers Ramban more is that that didn't bother the Egyptians. What would bother the Egyptians is the fact that he was a Hebrew. Never mind the fact that he was a convicted prisoner, but no, a convicted criminal. But the fact that he's a Hebrew, that's what would bother them. But he says to them, Hanimtsach hazeh, we're going to find anyone like this around who has the talent that he does that we need. And they agree. That's basically what happens. And then in the third line there, va'acharei shahodu, and after they agree, they admit, they agree, yep, you're right, we're not going to find anyone quite like this among our own. Amar Yosef, then he said to Yosef, acharei hodia Elokim otcha et kol zot, after God has informed and let you know all of this. What does it mean, kol zot, all of this? Presumably, we always think it means those two dreams that he just interpreted for Paro, right? He says, "Ki me'asher haya hapitaron tov v'nachon be'enei Paro v'nei avadav." Once the solution was good and correct and seemed proper in the eyes of Paro and that of his servants, haya be'eneihem, it was in their, he was in their eyes, meaning he appeared to them, ki'ilu kvar ba hakol kol Moshe partalem, as if it all had come to be. It says that after God has informed you all of this, it's like Paro is totally confident in Yosef's interpretation. It's as if it's already happened. He's like, it's so clear that that's what it means, which is also fascinating in and of itself. It, as Ramban ends that paragraph there, Ilu kvar ba hakol, it's as if everything has already come to be, Moshe partalhem, as he interpreted to them. They're so convinced. But I think part of the reason Ramban picks up on what I said is because of that repeat of Vayomer Paro, Vayomer Paro. If we go back, he doesn't say this inside, this is my own interpretation. If you go to Lamed Chet, he says again, Vayomer Paro el avadav. He says to himself, have we found anyone quite like this? And then immediately again, the next pasuk, again, Vayomer Paro, and Paro says, El Yosef. So clearly he turns to his servants and speaks to them and says, we've got to appoint this guy. We're not going to get anyone local as good as him. You might not like his nationality, but he's good. And then he turns to Yosef afterwards, after he seeks their approval. That's, I think, how Ramban, what leads Ramban basically to his reading. That first he turns, he convinces them, and then he turns back to Yosef. Yeah, Debbie.
Yeah, so if Yosef was so despised, even though they needed him, it changes the idea later on, saying Paro forgot Yosef, because they never really wanted him in the first place. He was just the best guy they could get, when they enslaved the Jews.
So Debbie's saying, well, it turns everything around, and when Yosef wasn't because necessarily they want him, it's just the best they could get. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly possible that the Paro's council thought of it. The council, thought of it that way. Paro himself seemed to be, personally touched by Yosef. Yeah. When it comes down historical lines, why do we have Yosef So at the end of the day, you know, expect them to be a bit grateful to Yosef either way, and to have karat hatov, you know. But as we know that things change by the book of Shemot, everything's already changed, as we know. Right, different paro as to what that means. Right, Vayakom Melech Chadash, right, and a new king arises, and we know there's a dispute in the Gemara between Rav and Shmuel. Is that really a new king, or just he made himself a new king? And it's amazing how people can just, you know, forget the past. So yeah, it's a good point. So we said et kol zot, right? Going back to that pasuk Lamentet, achrei hodia Elokim otcha et kol zot. After God had informed you et kol zot of all of this. So first Ramban's answer, as we just read, was that all of this, which we're convinced is going to happen. But kol usually means more than just one thing, all of this. So Ramban gives another suggestion in the next paragraph, beginning by v'yitachen. V'yitachen, and it could be, says Ramban, Sheyirmoz, that it's alluding to with et kol zot, that the phrase et kol zot, all of this, is alluding to gam lamash siper lo sar hamashkim, also that which the butler, the chief butler, had told him. Because God, basically, Paro says, God has informed you of all of this. What's all of this? It's just one dream, no, or two dreams, one night, right? What's all of this? So Ramban says it could also be that Paro is reaffirming that which the chief butler had told him. Because he also had dreams which Yosef successfully interpreted. And similarly, we find elsewhere, all these matters. What is all these matters? When Yaakov is talking to Lavan, it's talking about habrachot hanizkarot kodem lachem, the brachos which were mentioned above. So the phrase kol zot, all of this, usually means everything prior to what's just happened. So it's not just Paro's story, but it's the fact that he has faith based on the fact that he's already interpreted the butler's dream successfully, and the baker's as well, although he's not around to tell the tale, and also Paro's dreams now. Amar, Paro says, after God has informed you and given you this great wisdom, to interpret all hidden and unrevealed dreams. Nothing that you have said, out of all the words you have said, will not come to be. There's no one as wise and clever in this matter like you at all. And you therefore are fitting to take leadership and kingship, and to be a deputy to me. That is what Paro says. Et kol zot, says Ramban, is coming on everything. It's not just going on a whim that Yosef's going to be right. Et kol zot, knowing that he has previous, right, with the butler and the baker, again, which might be a little bit of understanding as to why Paro is so ready to go to Yosef's interpretations here, not because it's fitting to him, but because he has previous, right? He has a good CV when it comes to interpreting dreams, and that's basically what he says. So we know that Paro makes him into the deputy, the viceroy of Egypt, the Mishneh LaMelech, the deputy to the king, highest prestigious role. He does an interesting act, which we actually see later on in Tanakh, which Ramban reflects upon now, which is that he gives him his ring. And that's the last Ramban on page 1. Vayasar Paro et ta'bato me'al yado, and Paro removes his ring from on his hand. So first he quotes Rashi, and he says, Netinat tabat hamelech, the giving of the ring of the king, he ot, is a sign, lemishin notna liot sheni lo ligdula, to one whom the king makes his second in command in greatness. Lashon Rashi, that's Rashi's interpretation, which is that it's a symbol of you are my number two. You're basically your number two after me. Hanachon, and the truth, says Ramban, he adds another layer to it. It's not just any ring. Shetabat hamelech, the ring of the king, he chotmo, it's his signet ring, which he uses to sign every edict and order. Ki'inyan, just like it says, and he's quoting from later on in Tanakh, much later on in Tanakh, just like it says in Megillat Esther, v'chitmu b'tabat hamelech, and sign with the ring of the king. It's amazing. Ramban is extrapolating interpretation here, using something which happened, over 1,000 years later, the story of Esther, Achashverosh coming and saying, yep, take my ring. And what is he doing with it? What does it mean to sign with the ring of the king? It must be we're talking about a signet ring, right? That was the ring. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry, which is like, oh, look, I've got a crown, I've got a ring. But no, it's specifically a signet ring, which is a symbol of saying you have the power to do whatever you want. And there's no more terrifying moment for me, at least when I read Megillat Esther, when you hear that pasuk that he gives his ring to Haman. And Achashverosh gives his ring to Haman and says, basically, you can write whatever law you like. You have my stamp. That is this image of giving over the ring, says Ramban. That here you have my ring, you have my signature. You can sign and make whatever order, whatever edict, whatever decree you like. And the Ramban is taking that image from much later on in Tanakh by Esther, and now using a later image to understand what's going on here so many years earlier. V'hinei, and behold, this is exactly what happens, says Ramban. Natan lo hachotam, he gives him his signet ring. Liot nagid u'metzaver b'chol hamalchut, to be the leader and commander of and dictator of the entire kingdom. V'yachtom b'tabat hamelech kol asher yechpot, and he can sign with the ring of the king, with the king's signature, with his stamp, whatever he wishes. And that is really the power that Yosef is given here. It's not just a ceremonial position, but he is given the ultimate leadership to do whatever he likes. But again, it's just that image that Ramban's saying, well, we have this image later on in Tanakh. Let's take that and re-understand what's going on at the very beginning in Sefer Bereshit, the imagery of handing over the ring. Not just any ring, but the ring with which a person can push through any decree that they wish. So that's the Yosef. And we know, as it goes to be, there's 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And we know that the famine affected everywhere, not just Egypt. And that takes us back to Yaakov and his sons in the land of Canaan. And that takes us to the top of page 2. Okay. Vayar Yaakov, and Yaakov saw, Ki yesh sheva b'Mitzrayim, there's plenty, there's food in Egypt. Vayomer Yaakov levanav lama titrao, and Yaakov says to his sons, why are you hesitating? Why are you delaying? Vayomer, and he says, Hinei shemati, I've heard, Ki yesh sheva b'Mitzrayim, there's food in Egypt. Rudu shama, go down there. V'shivru lanu misham nicheh v'lo na'amot. Go down there and we'll eat rather than die. Meaning, our life's in the balance. We're going to have to go to Egypt. They're the only place where they have supplies. And 10 of Yosef's brothers go down to Egypt to collect food from Egypt. Fascinating. Again, it says Asara because we know Binyamin is not there. Rambam will talk about that in a moment. Whereas Binyamin, again, the brother of Yosef, the Torah is always telling us it's his brother. Yaakov did not send Etechav with his other brothers. Ki Amar, because he said, lest a disaster comes to him on the way. I think it's clear here. Why is it telling us it's Binyamin Achi Yosef? Because clearly Yaakov has trauma what happens when he sent Yosef, and therefore he doesn't want the same thing to happen to Binyamin, his brother. Pasuk K, the story continues. And Israel come down to collect among all those who have come. There was a famine in the land of Canaan. What does it mean, betocha ba'im, among those who are coming? They're clearly not the only ones who are coming from the land of Canaan, right? There's a whole line, a whole queue waiting. Yosef hu hashalita la'aretz, and behold, Yosef is the ruler over the land. Hu hamashpir l'chol am ha'aretz, right? This is almost like Hashem, the Torah, telling us objectively, and lo and behold, it's Yosef that they're coming to. They don't realize it yet. Hu hamashpir l'chol am ha'aretz. He's the one who gives food to all the people of the land. And Yosef and the brothers of Yosef come, and they bow down to him twice, or they bow down to him on the ground, with their face on the ground. And Yosef sees his brothers. Again, that word that we talked about last week, haker, recognize. Again, repeating itself. Yosef recognizes them, for who they are. And he acts as a stranger towards them. And he speaks harshly towards them. And he said to them, where have you come from? And they said, we've come from the land of Canaan to collect food. Again, the Torah uses that magic word. Yosef recognizes them, and they did not recognize him. Now, the final pasuk, which is important for Ramban, and Yosef remembered the dreams that he dreamt regarding them. And he said to them, your spies, you've come to spy out the land. That's a very important pasuk, which we're gonna go to now. Yosef remembers his dreams. What is the link between Yosef remembering his dreams and him acting towards them harshly and accusing them of being spies? So that's what Ramban is going to talk about now. Again, that final pasuk tet. But Yizkor Yosef chalamot asher chalam lehem. Yosef remembered his dreams which he dreamt. Vayomer lehem, and therefore somehow that causes him to turn to the brothers and accuse them of being spies and acting harshly towards them, which then leads to what? Him imprisoning Shimon in prison, and then the rest of them going back up, and they have to bring down Binyamin in order for him to release Shimon. So Ramban talks about this now. And it's a very important Ramban in terms of just understanding Yosef's whole mentality in terms of his plan here, which is different from other commentators, but we're going to have a look at what Ramban says. So first he says, Vayizkor Yosef et ha'chalamat asher chalam lehem. Yosef remembers the dreams that he dreamt. What does it mean, chalam lehem? He dreamt to them. Aleihem. It means about them. It's not referring to the dreams, but lahem is referring to the brothers. He remembers the dreams that he dreamt about the brothers. Vayeda, and he knew Shenit Kaimu, that they were coming to be true. Shaharei hishtachavula, because they bow down to him. Lashon Rashi. That's Rashi's comment. Chalam lehem means that the dreams which he dreamt about the brothers, and he suddenly, why does he remember them? Because he has this image of his brothers all bowing down in front of him. That was precisely the image of the dream, right? All the bundles of wheat bowing down to his bundle. V'lefi da'ati. So Rashi says he knew that the dreams had come true because they're bowing down. Ramban turns it on its head now. V'lefi da'ati, in my opinion, says Ramban, shedavar behefech. It's the opposite. Not that the dreams have come true, but the dreams have not come true. Ki Omar HaKatuv, because the Torah says, Ki birot Yosef et echav mishtachavim lo, that when Yosef sees his brothers bowing down to him, Zachar kol hachalamat asher chalam lehem. The Torah says he remembers all the dreams that he dreamt. And he knew shelo nitkayem echad mehem. He knew that one of them has not. Shelo hitkayem echad mehem b'pam hazot. That they have not come true on this occasion. Ki yodeh b'pitronam, because he knew regarding their interpretation, Ki chol echav yishtachavu lo, because it's not true what Rashi says Ramban. Because according to the dream, there's only 10 of them here, and the Torah emphasizes that, right? Because Binyamin stayed behind. According to the dream, kol echav yishtachavu lo, all his brothers are supposed to bow to him. Bitchila, from the very beginning, min hachalom harishon, in the very first dream. In the first dream, it was 11 bundles bowing down to him, not 10. V'hinei anachnu ma'almim alumim, as it says in the beginning of Vayeshev, we were bundling bundles. Anachnu, us, yirmoz l'kol echav echad asar, is referring to all of the brothers, says Ramban. So unlike Rashi, who says, he sees the dreams are coming to be true, and he feels, okay, so there's prophecy coming true here. Ramban says, no, that's not what happens at all. Seeing only 10 brothers makes Yosef think, wait a minute, the dreams aren't coming true. How am I going to engineer it that they do come to pass? He sees, wait, the image is incomplete here. I need Binyamin down here too. Clearly there's a plan that Binyamin is also supposed to come down as well. And Yaakov, right? Right. As Talila says, and Yaakov as well. That's exactly how it continues. Upam Sheinit, in the second time, the second dream. So time number one, only the brothers are all supposed to bow down. Upam Sheinit, and the second time, meaning the second dream, Yishtachavu lo hashemesh v'yareach, then the sun and the moon, v'chadas v'kochavim, then they're all supposed to bow down. Min hachalom hasheni. That's the second dream. But time number one is supposed to be just the brothers, and even that hasn't come true yet. In polar opposite to Rashi. Rashi says they've come true. Ramban says no, because I understand the dream says anachnu, all the brothers have to come down. And that's precisely why Yosef does what he does here, because he wants dream one to come true. Therefore, he has to have a pretext to have Binyamin come down to Egypt as well, because that's obviously where the family meant to settle.
So the Shemesh and Yareach would represent
it's clear.
Yaakov and
Rachel is not alive.
Right.
That leads Rashi in the name of Chazal to say that you don't have a dream which doesn't have a little bit of untrue nature to it. Although Rashi has this opinion that perhaps it was Bilhah who basically was like the stepmother for him, because she was his mother's maidservant who basically comes down. Right. Well, Yaakov we know comes down immediately afterwards. It's not clear. It's not clear that Ramban necessarily says that it means specifically Yaakov here. But he knows that dream number one is supposed to be the brothers, and then dream number two is the entire family comes down. And that's what dream number two represents. But he's saying, unlike Rashi, even dream number one hasn't come true. I've got to get Binyamin down, because clearly God has a plan for us in Egypt, which is obviously, we know them all settling in Egypt, which follows into the whole story of Mitzrayim, which has already been decreed, according to Ramban, way back when, as we know from end of Lech Lecha, the whole Brit Ben Abtarim, and then the covenant of the Brit Milah, the end of Pasha Lech Lecha, and also Ramban has accused it being a punishment because Abraham had already gone down to Egypt.
But then he has to actually engineer it to come true. Is it really coming true?
it's fascinating. Is it really coming true? It's certainly coming true. It's the question of what a person's role is here. But he clearly sees we're supposed to come here. That's the prophecy that he's received. Yosef, it is. I mean, if you call it nevuah, I wouldn't even necessarily call it nevuah. It's a dream, but it's a fine line how you would define it. But clearly, he sees that is where they're supposed to be, and that God has put him in this role for a reason, which is to help his brothers down in Egypt, and that he has to get them down there. So this is how Ramban understands it. That second last line in the first paragraph, the kivan shelo ra'a Binyamin imahem. So seeing as he sees that Binyamin is not with them, chashav zot tachbula, he comes up with this plan, she'alil aleihem, which he accuses them falsely of whatever being spies, kedei sheyavu gamin Binyamin achiv elav, that they should also bring his brother Binyamin to him, lekayem hachalom harishon tchila, in order to first fulfill dream number 1. That's why he does what he did. And then this explains a bigger question, which is, why on earth does he not reveal himself right now? Ramban's understanding is because he sees himself as having a role in fulfilling the dreams. The Al-Ken, and therefore, the next paragraph says Ramban, this is exactly why Al-Ken, therefore, lo ratzah hagid lahem ani Yosef achichem. He doesn't want to tell them, I'm Yosef, your brother. Why doesn't he reveal himself immediately when he sees them? Because he understands there's a bigger plan at play rather than his own personal feelings. This is how Ramban understands it, in stark contrast to many other commentators. He says, I can't reveal myself because I understand there's a bigger plan. That's why he doesn't want to say to them, Ani Yosef achichem, v'lomar, and to tell them, Maharu ya'ala, quickly, va'alu alavi, go to my father, v'yishlach agalot, and send the carts, kasher asa imahem b'pam hashniya. That's why he doesn't quickly call Yaakov down like he does the second time. Because of course his father would have come straight away without a doubt. Why didn't he do it? Because he understands that there's a bigger plan at play, which is he's supposed to get the brothers all down to Egypt. And presumably that's also part of their own atonement and their own sugar process for that which they have done until now, which is all the brothers coming. That image we'll have at the beginning of next week's parasha of Yosef, of Yehuda standing before Yosef and saying, you're not going to touch my younger brother. When you have a child of Leah defending a child of Rachel and saying, I'm not going to let you touch him, that is clearly the image which is supposed to fix everything that happened years earlier. And he understands that has to happen before he can call Yaakov. That's how Ramban understands here, why he didn't call Yaakov straight away. And he does this whole thing accusing them of spies. It wasn't for personal revenge. It was because there's a bigger plan at play, which is the brothers have their own process to go through before Yaakov can come down. In the middle of that second line there, and then only once the first dream has come to be true, then he tells them to fulfill the second dream by bringing down Yaakov as well, and the whole family. And he goes so far as to say this must be Yosef's logic, because if that wasn't the case, then if not for this, Yosef will be committing a terrible sin, to torment his father, to keep his father in extra days of mourning and bereavement. Al Shimon, for Shimon, who he then throws in prison while he sends the rest of the brothers back to get Binyamin. Alav, and also by not telling his father that he's alive. It's a fact. We'll talk about that in a second. And even if he wanted to torment his brothers a little bit for what they did to him, how could he not have mercy on his father's old age? He did everything in its proper time to fulfill the dreams, because he knew that they definitely are going to come to be. And this is part of Ramban's general approach here, which is, why didn't he talk earlier? Well, when he was in prison, there wasn't much he could have done. But in general, he understood, unlike others who understood. One approach is to say that Yosef really felt abandoned. But that's not Ramban's approach. Yosef felt abandoned. What happened? The last thing he knows, his father says, go to your brothers in the field. And what happens? His brothers put him in a pit. They take his coat and they throw it. So one way of understanding, and there are many thinkers like this as well. Rav Yoel Ben Nun is a Tanakh teacher in Alam Shvut, who he also understands this way and says, basically, and this I think is perhaps more the simple understanding of Psukim, is that Yosef thought, I didn't think Yaakov wanted me. We have precedent for the brothers of the non-primary wife being sent out, and he perhaps thought that you have Yishmael is sent away by the word of Hashem. We have then when Keturah's children are sent away because they're not the natural heirs, the whole thing with Yaakov and Esav, there's what to talk about. Just what it means to be in the chosen family, that not every child is chosen. But in some sense, he thinks that Yaakov might have had a hand in it. That's one way of understanding it. Yaakov's sending him off to the field to his brothers, who then ship him down to Egypt.
But then
He'd
he
think-
think that that's
But these dreams happen first. So he that's why he's like so mesmerized about it. Because of what you said, Yedida, that's exactly what Ramban says is not the case. This can't be, because Yosef knows he has a prophecy that that's not meant to be. And that's why he keeps his mouth shut, because not because he thinks his father doesn't want him, but the opposite. Because for Ramban, it's not because he feels abandoned by Yaakov. It's because he understands he's been sent for a higher purpose. Many people don't dislike this Ramban because of it. Where was his mercy? He didn't think to send a letter. Ramban even arrives at this understanding. Even he talks about later, once he arrived at Egypt and he sees how close Egypt is, or once he arrived in Eretz Israel, sorry, and he sees how close Eretz Canaan, Eretz Israel is from Egypt. I guess he really understood, that you can send a letter in a matter of days on camelback, and he would have got there, and he doesn't. He understands there must be a bigger thing at play. It's so close, and how much more so nowadays, but it was so close for him just to send a message back home. People were going back and forth a lot. And he didn't. There must have been like a divine element at play. So Ramban doesn't take the personal approach of, well, I thought he didn't, I don't think he wanted me. No, he understands that there's a bigger reason at play as to why he's been sent down to Egypt. And we know Ramban in general likes this idea of that everything is engineered, and it's the idea of hashgacha pratit and the maseh avotzim and lebanim, and that everything has a reason, and that everything is put in the right place, and that also has an effect for generations to come. And that's precisely what's happening here. Says Ramban that he did it because he understands there's a prophecy and there's a purpose for him to be in Mitzrayim. And we know that's part of the bigger prophecy of the Am Yisrael ending up in Egypt. So he says it must be that. Otherwise he'd be committing a terrible sin, says Ramban, to torment his father. And even if he wanted to, worry his brothers a little bit, it's not his place to cause such pain. And he goes on in the next paragraph and says, this explains exactly why Yosef did what he did. It was all Hashem Shemayim in order to bring the prophecy into fruition. And he said the next paragraph, even the second matter, not only this pretext where he accuses them of being spies and keeps Shimon in prison, but also the second matter where he hides his cup in Binyamin's sack at the end of the parasha. It wasn't his intention to torment them. He suspected maybe they have some animosity and hatred towards Binyamin. That they would be jealous of him due to their father's love of him, just like they were jealous of him. So he says, why is it that he's doing this whole thing with Binyamin? He wanted to see that they are looking after Binyamin in the way that they did not do to him, because perhaps he also inherited this special love. Same way they resented him, and he wanted to see, well, how are they going to defend Binyamin? So he has the gevir, the goblet, hidden in Binyamin's sack to see if the brothers will now stand up for him. That's option number one. Or Shema, or maybe Hirgish Binyamin Shaya Yadam be Yosef. Perhaps Binyamin thought that they had a hand against Yosef. So maybe Binyamin thought Shaya Yadam be Yosef, that they also had a hand in Yosef, and that as a result, Binyamin, who was still at home during the whole story where they sold Yosef, perhaps Binyamin had issues with the brothers, fighting and hatred. And therefore he wanted to see if the brothers were united with Binyamin, either because they resented him or because Binyamin resented them because he suspected them of selling Yosef. But Al-Ken, and there, because don't forget, Binyamin wasn't there, so he didn't necessarily know. He could only suspect what happened to Yosef. But Al-Ken, and therefore, Binyamin. He didn't want Binyamin to go back with them. Maybe they're going to put their hand against Binyamin the same way they did against him. Mamash, like PTSD here. Until he had checked whether they genuinely love Binyamin. And as we know, they do pass the test, and they say they go back down. They all go back down with Binyamin, and they stand before him and say, "You don't touch our father's beloved son." And that's when Yosef says, "Okay, there's been a completion here and closure, and now I can reveal myself." Ulezen it's kavnu bo rabotenu. And so Ramban goes so far as to say this isn't his own pshat. This is exactly what Chazal meant in the Midrash. Ulezen it's kavnu bo rabotenu b'Bereshit Rabbah. This is exactly what the sages refer to in the Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, where it recites Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, where Rabbi Chia says, bar Abba says, Kol hadvarim she'ata koreh shediber Yehuda b'fnei Achiv, everything that he reads before his brothers, Ad Sheta Magia, all the way that the whole dialogue at the beginning of Parashat Vayigash next week, all the way up to V'lo Yachal Yosef Litapek, all the way up to where it says Yosef could not withstand himself and then, not restrain himself anymore, and then reveals himself. All of this, Hayabo Pius li Yosef Pius lechav. It was as appeasement to Yosef and to his brothers as well, Pius le Binyamin, and appeasement to Binyamin as well. Pius li Yosef, it was an appeasement or for Yosef, because he finally saw how Yehuda, who is like the leader of the brothers of the sons of Rachel, is willing to put his life on the line for the children of Rachel. And it's that image and that line, that's exactly what Chazal are referring to, says Ramban, in this plan of Yosef. That really it's all there to check that everything's okay with the brothers. There's a prophecy, there's a prophecy here at play, and B, to check there really is a full unity before he lets Binyamin go back off with them. It's almost like there's a divine reason and a personal reason as to his plan here. And this is what he goes on, but Ramban is steadfast in this, and there are others who really disagree with him, but this is all part of a bigger plan. And he says here in the penultimate paragraph there, V'chen ani omer, and I similarly say, shekol ha'inyanim ha'ele, all of these matters, Yosef were with Yosef, mechachmato b'pitrona chalomot, due to his wisdom and to understanding the interpretation of the dreams. Kiyesh litmar, because you should be astonished. Achar she'amad Yosef b'Mitzrayim yamim rabim, that Yosef was in Egypt for many days or many years. Right? He was, even before he got put in prison, still in Potiphar's house, right? He was a leader, right? He was a leader in a great, in a prominent house in Egypt. How could he not even send one single letter to his father? To let him know that he's alive, and to comfort him. Right? It's only 6 days away. Ramban, again, when he came to Eretz Yisrael, really understood the proximity, and it can only be for divine reasons that he didn't do it. And even if it was a year away, he should have sent back a message. And he would have basically, he would have told him how much it is to redeem him, and he would have redeemed him in a great amount of wealth. He would have paid to have him released. But he saw that he saw that the bowing down of his brothers to him, and also the second dream of his father, and all his descendants coming with him. He understood it cannot be that it's going to be in their homeland. And he was hoping that they would come down to Egypt when he saw his great success there. He saw that this is where I'm meant to be, this is where the family is supposed to come. For Kol Sheken, how much more so, after he hears about the dream of Paro, where it becomes clear to him, that they're all going to inevitably come down to Egypt, because that's where the food is, and it is there that all his dreams will come to play. So this is Ramban says explicitly what he alluded to before. He says it black and white here, that the whole purpose is they're supposed to come down here. And the whole, perhaps if you like, the whole reason for Paro's dreams, as well as to get Yosef technically out of the pit into the position of power, is clearly to show you that no, he understood this is where my family are meant to eventually be. So again, you can take it or leave it, but Ramban's understanding is very clear that no, there are bigger powers at play rather than Yosef's own personal revelation. He understood this is where he's supposed to be. And he's set here as a position of power, and that is why he did not tell Yaakov earlier, either before when he was in Potiphar's house or when he was in prison, but even after that, when he became viceroy of Egypt. It's only affirmed by Paro's dreams that this is where he's supposed to be, and this is where the prophecy is going to come to be. In stark contrast to perhaps other interpretations that I mentioned, where it's not that, but it's just a personal thing. For Ramban, no, it's all part of the bigger picture and the divine plan. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just mention one final matter, which is that Yaakov, when they go back up without Shimon, who's in prison, Yaakov tells them, okay, please go back, and he gives this pasuk. This is the beginning of page 3. So you have a look at the beginning of page 3. Yaakov sends them back, and he says the following pasuk. He says in Yudalad, in the first line, in the middle, the El Shaddai Yiten Lachem, right? God will give you rachamim, mercy, lifnei ha'ish, before the man. He obviously has no idea that the man is his son Yosef. V'shilach lachem et achichem acher, and he will release achichem acher, your other brother, bet Binyamin and Binyamin, because he's now agreeing that Binyamin will go down with them the second time. Va'ani, and as for me, kasher shacholti shacholti, as I've been bereaved, I'll be bereaved. What is this achichem acher, your other brother? So Rashi understands it based on the Midrash that it's Ruach HaKodesh, that the other brother is referring to Yosef, who went missing 20 years ago. Ramban understands differently. So who is the other brother? Who's not with them right now besides for Yosef? Shimon. Shimon is in prison right now. He's being withheld as hostage until they come and bring down Binyamin. And that is who it's referring to according to the Pshat. And that's what Ramban says here in that first Ramban. And it just gives you a little bit of background that he doesn't even call him by name. And so Ramban just addresses that. Just an interesting point that we might not necessarily pick up on, because we're so like influenced by Rashi. It says it's Ruach HaKodesh, it's referring to Yosef. No, it's referring to Shimon according to the Pshat. So
If Yosef wasn't supposed to know the brothers, then how is he supposed to know that there was another brother for you to go back?
He asks them.
He asked them.
He asked them, the Pesukim, do you have any other family? And they say, we have one brother with our
On
father.
what basis? Yeah, but why? On
What?
what basis would he said that they all had to come?
Because he is accusing them of being spies, and he says if you want to prove the story straight, so that's the whole pretext that he tells them you're spies, and you're going to prove it by bringing your other brother down. And I'm holding one of you captive until then. Well, I mean, he didn't care if he did. He just wanted Binyamin down. So the logic might not be there. So, yeah. Everything that our leaders tell us is logical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very right. So that's but for him it worked.
If I ask you have a brother, you bring in your most precious commodity here.
Right.
You know, swear on your most precious commodity. Show me your other brother.
The thing is that there's nothing he could say whatever he wanted because he's the leader and they're totally dependent upon him. But I did want to mention this interesting Ramban here. And you know, the leader should send your other brother and Binyamin. Nir'eh seems like they're pshat according to the simple understanding, but this isn't referring to, like Rashi says, to prophecy about Yosef, but rather just Shimon. Ki lo haya Shimon ratzoi aviv ba'avod v'Shechem. That Shimon was not particularly wanted or beloved by his father because of what he did with Shechem. V'lakach, and therefore he doesn't say, therefore lo amar, he doesn't say et Shimon b'ni v'et Binyamin. He doesn't say Shimon, my son, and Binyamin. What does he say? He just says your other brother. Ki lo yazkirenu b'shmo, he doesn't call him by name. Almost like he's resentful of him. The kasher azvu b'Mitzrayim yamim rabim, and especially after they've been many years, many days in Egypt. Ilu haya bebeito lechem lo shalach adayin Binyamin v'yanichem b'Mitzrayim. And that's why many yamim rabim, and he delays and daughters wait so there's no food left. But it's almost like Yaakov here did not was angry still with Shimon. And we know that at the end of his life in Vayechi, he does rebuke Shimon and Levi. But I just thought it's just an interesting Ramban that we might necessarily picked up on. That Achichem Acher might be referring to Shimon. Ramban picks up on the fact, why doesn't he call him by his name then? So there's the Midrash which says it's deliberately ambiguous because Yaakov is subconsciously or through prophecy referring to the fact that it's the other brother will also come, meaning Yosef. He doesn't mention Shimon here because it's still resentful about everything that he did those years ago in Shechem. So we will stop for now. Wishing you all a Chanukah Sameach. Reminding you all, we have Lunch and Learn here on Tuesdays at 1. And those who can't make it, we also have on Zoom. Food is good. You can ask Yedida Naomi. And tomorrow I'm going to be discussing whether married women should light their own Chanukiah or not. So that tomorrow at 1 here and also on Zoom. Have a wonderful day and Chanukah Sameach to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shavuot Tov.
Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you. Chanukah Sameach.
Chanukah Sameach. Bye.